Welcome to the Wordy Pair Podcast, your go-to hub for all things writing, world building, and the occasional dive into the weird and wonderful world of fiction. We're breaking down the barriers between you and your next great story. Whether you're a seasoned scribe or just scribbling your first sentences, we've got something for you. We'll be discussing everything from crafting compelling characters to dissecting the good, the bad, and the downright bizarre in the world of fiction. Okay, this script says you guys are eccentric. Isn't that just a 3-syllable word for weird? No offense. So, whether you're in need of inspiration, a good laugh, or just a couple of weirdos to keep you company on your writing journey, you're in the right place. Thanks for tuning in to the Wordy Pair Podcast.
All right, hello and welcome everybody. We are the Wordy Pair. As always, I'm Rudy.
And I'm Justin.
And we've got a very short mini-series for you guys today. We're going to be talking in this episode and the next episode about a couple of Nero Wolfe books, and they're going to be, the reason we're splitting up in two is because one book is a novel, like a full-size novel, and the other book is a combination of 3 novellas into one, roughly novel-sized book. And there's very different techniques that go into producing both of these types of stories. And so we thought it would be interesting to talk about each story in turn and the differences between the two and what it goes into longer fiction versus shorter fiction. And so, we're going to be starting with Fer-de-Lance today. And next week you guys should have an episode with the 3 stories from Trio for Blunt Instruments. So, without further finagling, let's get started.
Yes. Archie, get your notebook out and report.
Verbatim. So, Fer-de-Lance. Fer-de-Lance
Where would you like to start with this?
Well, it's the first Nero Wolfe novel that was published, It is a fairly long novel for a Nero Wolfe book, coming out at nearly 300 pages, where most of them kind of top out in the mid to low 200s.
I believe it's the second longest one. I think Some Buried Caesar is the biggest.
Okay, interesting. Some Buried Caesar is also really good. We might want to talk about that someday as well. But
yeah, Nero Wolfe episodes are just our filler episodes when we don't have another topic.
Yeah, something like that. Well, they require a little bit of research, so this is. But the thing about Rex Stout, right, is that he was kind of he was a, very well received and popular writer of murder mysteries. Yeah, there are a bunch of them in American literature over the course of the last century, but Rex Stout is one of the ones who really just kind of got into that role. Basically, Fer-de-Lance was released in 1934, I believe, and he kept writing approximately 1 Nero Wolfe book per year until he died in the 1970s. And so, one of the things that you get to see if you read all the different Nero Wolfe books, starting from the start to finish, is you get to see how reality moves around Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin, even though they stay relatively static. It's not entirely true, because in this first book, both Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin are a little bit different from how you probably would, view them if you read a bunch of the later books. Wolfe is a lot more subdued. He doesn't bellow and things like that nearly as much. And Archie's voice, being the POV character, is very different in this book. So
he's a lot more brusque in this book.
Well, I don't know about brusque. I would say that he's more. He doesn't quite have that.
He's less slick. He has more sharp edges.
Okay, I see what you're saying. That's not what I would. He's less refined, I guess. But the other thing is that he's a little bit more obsequious towards Wolfe in this book as compared to later books. There's a bunch of passages in this book where he's like, "Oh, how I was delighted to see him do this genius thing," kind of thing. And that kind of dries up later on because one of the things that is interesting about Archie Goodwin is that he's not Watson. And so, distancing him from Watson in the stories is something that makes him more interesting, not less, in general. So,
yeah, whereas Watson was always at the boot heels of Sherlock Holmes to give a compliment or point out how great a genius is. These are still things that Archie does, but a lot of times the compliments are a little backhanded coming from him. He'll compliment Wolfe's genius in a way that...
There's a lot more focus by Archie on like how hard it is to deal with Wolfe sometimes in the later books. Whereas in this one, because the character is being introduced for the first time, he's like, oh, this character's a genius. Wolfe is a genius. Wolfe is a genius. He says this quite a few times throughout the purpose of the book. There's one, or maybe that wasn't in this story, but, or maybe it was. There's one point where Archie says he's about to say that Wolfe can't come to the door because he's infirm, and he's like, but I did that once, and I'll never do that again. Because
that
Wolfe
was this book.
Yeah, that was this
that
one.
was Fer-de-Lance.
So...
Fer-de-Lance, as Wolfe makes him pronounce.
Fer-de-Lance.
But yes, Rex Stout is the American mystery author. Agatha Christie and Conan Doyle that belong to good old jolly old England, I guess. And Maurice Leblanc's Arsène Lupin is the famous French thief, and America has Rex Stout's Nero Wolfe. And as usual, that we got the most quality product for our money.
Yes. Go America. You're so fine. So this book is interesting for a lot of reasons. Number one, it takes place in like deep in the Great Depression. And so already that creates a little bit of tension between some of the characters at the very beginning, because basically the story starts out with Fred Durkin, who doesn't have much of a role in this story, but he does have this role in the beginning and in the very end. He comes in and is basically there to ask Wolfe for a favor. And Wolfe is like, well, you're not here to ask for money. You're here to ask a question, you're here to ask a favor about a lady that you brought with you. And, this is one of the first contentions where Archie stands up. And an interesting thing about this book being a product written in 1933 and released in 1934 is that a lot of the slang is so old that you can't really understand it anymore unless you happen to study the slang of that time. There's a lot of phrases that show up in this book that are very, like, what? I've never heard that one before, but clearly the character is using it as some kind of, like, very common slang expression, and it's just completely foreign to me at this point.
Yeah, there's a character that Saul Panzer uses the phrase "lovin' babe."
Yes, in this book, and I think in none of the others.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever read it in any of the other books except for this one. And I remember it being a surprise when I came across it in this book, because I had read several books before I read this one.
Right. And the other thing about which edition do you have? Do you have the paperback Rex Stout Library, the purple one?
With the introduction by Lauren D. Esselman?
Yes.
Yes, that's
so
the one.
It's worth noting that this edition of Fer-de-Lance has a huge number of really bad typographical and typesetting errors in it.
I noticed 4 just casually reading through it. Like when he was referred to as Paul Panzer.
Which is inexcusable.
Yes, that's very inexcusable. But there was
Saul Panzer is an exceptional man, a remarkable man, and you don't call him Paul Panzer.
Maybe Paul Panzer was someone slightly different, and he did something slightly less exceptional just for that one page.
Just for that one line. But there's also, like, a sentence that's duplicated in the middle of the story where, like, I don't know if I could find it immediately by flipping around, but, like, there's literally a sentence that gets that half of it gets repeated twice, and then it goes back into the further sentence after that. I happen to own a copy of Fer-de-Lance that was published that was printed in 1934, and none of those typographical or typesetting errors are in the original. So this is entirely the fault of Bantam Crime Line Mystery of doing a crappy job of retypesetting Fer-de-Lance.
Yeah, especially back in the day when things had to be retypeset. I mean, even Terry Pratchett had a book where people were pointing out errors, and he said, I have the original manuscript here. Mine is perfect and doesn't have those errors.
Yeah.
And that was just, 30, 40 years ago.
Right. But I mean, like, they were introduced somewhere after the actual publication, because they're not in the first edition either. It's not like Wolfe. It's not like Stout was getting a really crappy publisher early on. They did a good job, but then some of the people that have taken the property and run with it in paperback form have done a rather poor job. The other thing worth noting is the censorship in the paperback version.
Yeah, this is the only version I have, so you'll have to jump on this.
Basically, Archie refers to some Italians using an unkind word for Italians, and he refers to Manuel Kimball using an unkind word, of which 2 of the uses of it are removed in the book, but one of them remains in the paperback, which I never quite understood, but there it is. So that's one of the points about these Bantam crime lines, is that unfortunately they were just kind of thrown together in a rather hurried fashion. Because I have another one that has a major printing error where, like, a few characters on one side of the text on a whole page or 2 is gone, and you just can't read it. Stuff like that. So be careful with these. But they are a good source for Nero to fill your Nero Wolfe craving. Just know that if you want the real deal, you're probably going to need to go a little further back in time.
Yeah, the mild changes that it sounds like they made don't really take anything out of context, fortunately.
No.
There's a couple of things about this particular novel, because it's the first Nero Wolfe novel. It's the introduction of the characters. Now it has an introduction.
Yes.
The introduction is by Lauren Esselman. And
yeah, I didn't bother to reread that for this episode, so if you did, go ahead.
Yeah, I did reread it, and he points out how the Nero Wolfe books they're interesting in the sense that you can pick up any single one of them, even the first one.
Yeah.
And you might not necessarily notice it's the first one. Now in this case, I think he's wrong, because there are certain stable characters that show up in all the other books that are missing in this book. Such as Inspector Kramer, who is in
they
pretty
appear
much
in
every
almost
other book.
all of the other books, but yeah, there are a few books where Kramer doesn't appear, for instance, that come later on.
And there's a couple of characters that you never see again, like I don't think Bill Gore ever shows up again after this
Bill Gore
book.
does show up in later books.
Oh, he does?
Oh yeah, I think one of the books is actually about Bill Gore being murdered.
Oh, okay.
Or that he something happens to him in one of the books. I'm pretty sure. I can't remember the name of the one that does that, but I'm pretty sure I read that, and it's like, oh, that's what happened to Bill Gore. That's why we don't see him in later books. We don't have one of the main side characters, which is a little bit of a strange phrasing, is a guy named Lon Cohen who works for the Gazette. He's replaced in this book by a guy named Harry Foster, who has a very small part in the book. Lon Cohen, on the other hand, often gets a pretty significant chunk for a side character, often helping Wolfe and Archie by giving them information or helping them to publicize certain things that they want publicized in order to drive a murderer out from cover, basically.
Yes, the Lon Cohen bits are another one of those little things that kind of make me feel like, because it's very obvious that Rex Stout read Sherlock Holmes and took some inspiration from that character. It's a little less obvious, but I'm convinced he took a lot of inspiration from Maurice LeBlanc as well. There's a character that I believe is directly inspired by Arsène Lupin, but there's also Lon Cohen himself is a liaison between Archie Goodwin and it's the Gazette, right?
Yeah, the Gazette.
The newspaper, the Gazette, that Wolfe and Archie will often use to instigate something or set something in motion by putting in ads or having Archie have a conversation with Lon Cohen that leads to something being printed in the newspaper, which was a regular thing that would happen in the Arsène Lupin novels. He would often, it was often said that people suspected him of being the highest shareholder of a certain newspaper, and that's why so many things got leaked to this newspaper about the things that were happening with the national thief of France.
I see. Interesting. So yeah, the point I think that you're moving toward is that there's some Lupin in Lon Cohen, and there's a lot of Lupin in Saul Panzer.
Yeah, Saul Panzer being the exceptional man he is, it's one of those things where despite the fact that we have the internet and people seem to dig up every single thing about every little reference that every single piece of fiction makes, I have never seen this one made before, and this will be the second time I think we've brought it up.
Yes.
But Saul Panzer, his character is very much like Arsène Lupin in that he's multi-talented. He's almost a wizard in the way that he can deal with things.
Yeah, his abilities are almost magical.
Yeah.
He always has exactly the right abilities that are needed for the situation. He's a master of disguise. He's a master of tailing. He can fly an airplane. You know, pretty much everything that you need to someone to do that Archie and Wolfe can't do, Saul Panzer can do.
Yeah, he's often praised by both Wolfe and Archie. Archie on several occasions mentions, even though he often gets angry when Saul Panzer interferes with what they're doing because he feels like he's being left out, Archie constantly compliments Saul Panzer's abilities.
Well, so I think there are instances where Saul Panzer is sitting in Archie's chair and Archie's kind of okay with it, but Ori Cather is not allowed to sit in Archie's chair.
No, that's actually a direct line from one of the stories.
Yes.
But yeah, the last thing I'll say about the whole Saul Panzer, Arsène Lupin thing, of course, is his name.
Mm-hmm.
Arsène Lupin was infamous for changing his name to complement his disguises. So in one story, he referred to himself as Prince Sernine, which was a slight variation on a rearrangement of the letters Arsène Lupin.
Right.
Saul Panzer is a slight variation on the rearrangement of the name Arsène Lupin.
Right.
There's a Z substituted for an S, but other than that, there's like actually, I think that's it.
There's a pretty significant overlap there, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they have a different number of letters in the two names, so it can't be perfect, but it's pretty close.
It's close enough, and he's close enough to the character that I am convinced he's very much supposed to be Arsène Lupin, and that's why his background remains so mysterious in the story.
Or he's a Arsène Lupin stand-in, basically, but it's a reference. But the other thing that's worth noting is that they do occasionally, in some of the stories, visit Saul Panzer's home, and he has a bunch of crazy, obscure, and expensive objects just kind of sitting around in his living room that kind of suggest that he has done a lot more than a lot of people than has been let on in the stories.
More than a private detective might do.
Yeah.
So let's knock that out of the way real quick. For the purposes of this book, we do have Fred Durkin, Ori Cather, and Saul Panzer. These are the three agents that Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin often go to when they need a little extra manpower.
Right.
With Saul being the supreme.
Well, so the way that they're typically described is that Saul Panzer is exceptional. He can do practically anything that a detective needs to do. Fred Durkin is a little bit he's not the smartest tool in the shed.
But he's above average.
But he's above average in all the places where it counts, and he's an exceptional tailor. Ori Cather is kind of the face man of the group, where he can basically talk anyone into anything, with a few exceptions here and there for story purposes in later stories. Ori doesn't have a whole lot of character in this story. He has a couple of lines, and his character is not really described in any detail. The same is true of Bill Gore, who is just kind of another pair of eyes and pair of hands for some of their adventures.
Yeah, and it's all the characters themselves are kind of I don't want to say thin. Like Rex Stout uses a lot of personalities over and over again in some stories. Like there tends to always be someone.
Well, so one thing that's worth noting about Rex Stout's Nero Wolfe character is that he usually only works for an extremely high fee. And so one of the character kind of tropey characters that you get in Nero Wolfe stories are the rich person who is absolutely not terrified, but ashamed of the fact that he has to deal with a private detective. And there's plenty of those characters in this book. There's at least 3 or 4. characters kind of like that, including a couple of members of the Barstow family, one of the members of the Kimball family, and the other kind of character trope that Wolfe often deals with is like the working class working man or working woman, and there's 2 of those in this story as well, and they're the kind of people where either they have to make Wolfe indebted to them in some other way in order to get him to work, or they have to, or the circumstances around why they want him to work have to be kind of forced on him, or he has to, in order to keep his reputation, he has to help them, kind of thing. So we see a lot of that. A lot of these side characters are moderately thin, but they get fleshed out a little bit. Fritz is a little weird in this book too. There's not much about Fritz, but he just kind of has a slightly weirder tone from how he is in a lot of the later books.
Yeah, it's not so much that, like when we're talking about the characters that are kind of, fresh for each novel, like the characters that only appear in that story for the purpose of the mystery. It's not so much that they're thin characters, it's just that Rex Stout was really good at having Archie Goodwin give a brief description, often metaphorical, of how he feels about each character, and it tells you a lot about the character without giving you more than a couple sentences.
Right. One thing that Archie does a lot is he kind of cartoonicizes the characters based on some notable aspect of their appearance, and that aspect of their appearance kind of becomes the lodestone that reminds you of that character throughout the story, kind of thing.
Yeah. That it keeps coming back to. Sometimes he'll just tell you how much he wants to punch someone in the face.
Yes.
And somehow that works as a description for that character.
Well, it helps you kind of... We get to know Archie very well, because he's the point of view character, right? So we get to kind of know a lot of his internal thoughts, and almost no internal thoughts of anybody else. So, we get to know Archie very well. We get to know all of his prejudices, we get to know all of his shortcomings in his ability to figure out the case. We get to know all of the times that he's angry at Wolfe for Wolfe being, intransigent in one way or another. We get to know Archie very, very well. And so because we know Archie very, very well, when Archie describes a character, we also kind of get the feel for that character based on the way that Archie based on how Archie chooses to describe that character, what elements of that character stand out to him. We can view that through our knowledge of Archie's character, which gives us even more depth into these characters that he's introducing.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not even a description of the character that gives us a little insight to how he's thinking. There's a character in Fer-de-Lance that is kind of withholding information from Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin. And at some point, after a brief interview with Nero Wolfe, she gets sent back home. Archie drives her home, and as he drops her off, he says something like, "Thanks for nothing, but no hard feelings."
Yeah, basically.
And
that's
and
Anna
so he's
Fiore.
like, yeah, he's not completely unimpressed with her, but he's not happy about the situation with her. Which
he does in this book. He wears his emotions on his sleeve a lot more than he does in the other books.
Yeah,
he's willing to tell her, no, you're welcome, and but no hard feelings, kind of thing. In this book, he's a little bit more tactful in a lot of the later books, but he does have that kind of edge to him where he can be rude to people and usually get away with it.
Yeah, and this leads to some of the best parts of the other books where they have a lot of confrontation with the police.
Right.
But talking just about Fer-de-Lance, I guess.
Yes.
Let's open the story here. We have a situation where Fred Durkin, one of the detectives that often works for Wolfe.
Yep.
It's interesting to note he seems a little different in this book than the rest of the books in the sense that he's described early on by Archie as not particularly liking Nero Wolfe, which seems to change a lot in the later books. Like he's almost like
it's not that he doesn't like Wolfe, it's that he kind of runs his mouth a little bit sometimes, and Archie has to rescue him.
Yeah.
So, the thing about the book is that it's taking place in the Great Depression. Fred Durkin is one of the people that Wolfe often pays to do work, but he had him on his payroll for a while, but because of money being tight, basically, he's said to Durkin, sorry, I can't, employ you and give you a weekly check. I'll pay you piecewise when you do stuff for me, but there's not going to be any weekly check to hold on to you. And so Fred's a little bit miffed about that because he's on hard times himself.
Yeah.
And so, he basically kind of blurts out, no, it's not even him that says it. It's that what's her name? The Maria Maffei. She says, Fred tells me that you're tight with money and blah 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 blah, and then Fred's like, sir, about you being tight with money, you know how, I could kind of get stressed out and get angry and kind of lash out a little bit when I'm talking to somebody. You're kind of sorry. And Archie rescues him, is like, come on, Fred, let's go.
Yeah.
Fred is always a little bit awkward. That's kind of an element of his character, is that he's not hard-boiled. He's a family man. He kind of lives a very normal life. And him being a detective, he's not the best fit for it, like personality-wise, but he is very good at it. So,
and just an interesting little side note that I've always enjoyed about Fred Durkin is that you go through a lot of the books, and he's the slightly above average detective that is surrounded by these three geniuses: Saul Panzer, Nero Wolfe, and Archie Goodwin.
Yeah,
but not only is he incredibly reliable. Towards the end of the books, there's, I believe it's in the Best of Families, maybe? Where,
you mean A Family Affair?
Or yeah, A Family Affair, where he says something at one point in the story that he basically says, yeah, I knew it. And the others are surprised, and they're like, there's no way you knew it. And he explains to them how he knew something that none of them had figured out.
Yeah.
But he didn't feel like saying anything because he didn't really know if... He didn't think it would go over well, basically.
Right.
But like he was ahead of the curve this one instance where it mattered so much more than anything else in the story. And even Saul Panzer was like, oh, you had it all figured out.
Yeah, calling him slightly above average is kind of underestimating him too. Like, he often gets called way above average by Archie. It's just that he doesn't have the brain power that Wolfe has to kind of puzzle things out. But as a working detective, he's really, really good.
He's incredibly reliable in every story he's in.
Yes.
But let's roll in.
So this story begins with him being a little bit unreliable. Basically, he brings in someone to ask a favor of Wolfe. And the person he brings in is Maria Maffei. She's she works as a maid in a rooming house, and her brother is missing, Carlo, right?
Right.
And there's actually a little funny scene where Wolfe says, oh, I know that you're not here for yourself, Fred. What does the lady that you came with need? And Archie's like, my ears are good. He didn't, she didn't say anything, and nobody said anything to her. And Wolfe's like, true, but Fritz was way nicer to Fred than he should have been. And he only has that tone in voice when he's talking to a woman. And thank goodness, because otherwise I would think he was a little nutty. So they bring Maria Maffei in. Maria Maffei's like, my brother is missing. I would pay you $1,000 to find him. And Wolfe basically says, well, not really. I'm not really interested, right? He's like, there's nothing in what you've shown me or what you've brought to me that brings my interest. $1,000 is not really that much money for me. And so, maybe I'll look into it a little bit, but I'm not interested yet. And that kind of sets the tone that Wolfe isn't like this, guy who's just doing it for the good of the world. He's very self-centered, and he's very careful to only give out the product of his amazing brain to people when he's expecting to get, properly compensated for it. He does this a lot, where he'll give all the evidence to the police, but he doesn't provide his conclusions based on the evidence. and his conclusions are what often end up, leading to the solving of the case.
Yeah, it's a trick he uses a lot because he has told the police everything, so nobody can turn around and say he was withholding anything from the police, while at the same time, he did not tell them the conclusion that would have pointed them in the direction they needed to go to apprehend a murderer.
Yes.
Usually he sees some wedge somewhere where he can cram a foot in and try to collect a fee for his services.
Yeah,
and oftentimes,
it's often something that someone says carelessly or something like that.
Yeah, and a lot of times he'll have someone coming to him that can't pay him, and he'll figure out a way to get money from someone else and still satisfy the person that couldn't pay him.
In fact, that's what happens in this story.
Yeah, well, in this particular story, Archie Goodwin sort of facilitates paying the person that couldn't. Well, she wasn't really looking for help. Anna Fiore was the one that.
No, Anna Fiore is just a witness, basically.
Yeah, but she did get a payoff in the end because Archie Goodwin felt like it, I guess. I guess it was earned given what she went through.
So let's step back and actually look at how the story's progressing. Maria Maffei leaves. A couple of days pass, and the police find Carlo's body. He's been killed. He's been stabbed in north of the city, behind the heart. But I mean, he's been stabbed north of the city and dumped out in this White Plains city where they often the White Plains is kind of like the out in the country for the Nero Wolfe books. They go there often, and basically, once Carlo is dead, there's not really anything else for Wolfe to do. So basically, he starts looking around for another way to possibly get something out of it. And what he finds is in the newspaper. He talks with Anna Fiore, and Anna Fiore says that she saw newspapers that Carlo had, and he had cut a big chunk out of the front page of one of them, which was unusual. He would usually cut out classified ads for looking for jobs, but this time it was a big thing on the front page. And the article that he cut out was an article talking about the death of a college professor out in White Plains. Barstow is his name. And this kind of leads Wolfe to do something very clever and interesting to try to get paid for the conclusions that he's made. He's made a conclusion about what happened here. He's taken these two disparate pieces of information and put them together in a way that nobody else did. And so what he does is he sends Archie to White Plains with a check. This
is a fantastic part of the story. Everything that Wolfe does up to this moment is, you're looking at it like, a mystery is slowly unfolding. But you're at the beginning of the story here. He takes this woman who comes to him and says, my brother is missing. Well, he can't help her. But then they find a body, and he looks at the situation of what's going on with the body, looks at the evidence that the police have, and makes a connection to something that he read in another newspaper. And then he sends Archie with this note. What was it, the district attorney?
It's a check.
Anderson?
He sends him to, he's either the district attorney or he's like a head prosecutor or something.
Yeah, so he'd worked with him on another case.
White Plains.
And
kind of, sort of. That also unfolds more later on.
Yeah.
But basically, he sends Archie with a check for $10,000 and says, I bet that if you dig this guy up, you'll find a needle in his belly with poison on it.
The absurdity of it, the absolute ridiculousness, and yet just in the beginning of the story, Nero Wolfe has put the police on the spot to exhume a corpse and do an autopsy to find out that this person did not, in fact, die from a heart attack. They died of being stabbed with a needle and poisoned, which is really funny for the rest of the book because the police go out of their way to try and find all these alternate theories to what is obvious at this point. At one point, because they discover that it's snake venom that is used to poison this guy, they actually start looking into that more seriously, as if the poison needle isn't there. That part actually to me was just like, what are the police doing here? This makes no sense. There's a needle in his belly and there's poison in his body, and Nero Wolfe said this would be the case. They all know that's what happened. Why are they looking at snakes?
This is another common trope in the Nero Wolfe stories is that the police don't want to believe that it's a murder, or they don't want to believe that the facts of the case are what they are. And Wolfe is always persistent about, no, this is what happened, and if you're continuing to try to, pretend that this isn't what happened, then I'm going to find a murderer and present the murderer to you via reporters, and you're not going to like it, right?
Yes, back when you could rely on reporters to actually want to present news in a way that may or may not humiliate the cops.
Right, exactly. So what happens is that Archie's kind of pushing on Wolfe to try to get this. Well, so the bet thing fails. Basically, what they do is they can't find the guy Anderson to make the bet. Anderson's rich, so they're like, well, Anderson might be able to bet 10 grand. The people who are at White Plains aren't willing to do it. Archie goes off, but because of the annoyance of Archie showing up with that check, basically that results in them deciding to dig up Barstow anyway. And of course, they find the needle. It gets published in the newspapers. And from New York, they're not really sure how much of an effect Wolfe has been seen to have up there. They're like, well, whatever. They're reading the New York Times, they're reading the New York Gazette, and they're not really that 100% aware of what the local papers up in White Plains said. But apparently, up in White Plains, everybody knows that Nero Wolfe is the one who figured this out. And then Anderson comes down and tries to offer Wolfe $500 to work on the case with him, and Wolfe's like, no, that's $0 to me, effectively. Go away. And Wolfe, and here we get a development that shows us another characteristic of Wolfe that happens a lot throughout the books, which Archie calls a relapse. Basically, sometimes in the middle of a case or in the middle of some investigation, Wolfe decides to pretend that he's never heard of it. He forbids all mention of it, and he goes and either sits in his room and reads books, or he goes and sits with Fritz and makes a bunch of random types of bits of food and taste tests them for days, possibly days at a time. So Wolfe goes into a relapse, and the whole case is kind of going around, moving forward without Wolfe doing anything, and Archie's extremely angry about this, only to find on Monday morning in the newspaper, Archie sees an ad, and the ad is offering a reward of $50,000 for the person who finds the murderer of Barstow. And it happens that coincidentally, Wolfe's relapse ends at the same time. And Archie's like, no, the relapse ended because you saw this ad. And Wolfe's like, I didn't see any ad. What are you talking about? And there's this great scene where Archie's like, you didn't see the ad. He's like, no, show me the ad. And Archie shows it to him, and Wolfe's like, excellent.
Now, this is actually one of the best dynamics that these two have is sometimes Nero Wolfe will just lose interest in what they're doing, and he'll need to be prodded. Right. And Archie is aware that is part of his job. It's mentioned outright sometimes by Wolfe and sometimes by Archie that he's there to kind of push Wolfe to keep working because Wolfe is not a fan of inertia.
He's a big fan of inertia, but
no, he'll come to a rest pretty quickly. He's he likes inertia when it will. But
he says in this whole book that inertia is the greatest force in the universe.
Yes, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he loves it. He's pretty fond of not working whenever he can. He's very good at creative inertia. Yeah.
Well, he's very lazy, is the way that Archie usually describes it.
Yeah. Yeah, so they now have this this line on $50,000, and Nero Wolfe wants to reel it in. He sends Archie to the Barstow estate.
It's interesting. It's more than that, because what happens is that Sarah Barstow is the daughter of the Barstow who died. The reward was presented by Ellen Barstow, the wife of the Barstow who died. And Sarah shows up and she's like, this happens a lot too, where someone comes to ask Wolfe for something and they phrase it really badly because they're not used to dealing with detectives. And so, they insult Wolfe's profession. They insult Wolfe himself. Things like this happens a lot. And basically what ends up happening is that Wolfe makes a deal to find the murderer. And if the murderer is the person that Sarah Barstow's trying to shield, he won't tell the police. But he will still, hope for a gift from the family. It's one of the things that Wolfe tries not to do often is to sound like he's blackmailing someone, and so he will often arrange things so that people know that, hey, if you sent me a check, that would be really cool, but you're not obligated technically, right? There's a lot of that.
Well, I think the best example of that was what was the title of the story where the woman that's supposed to inherit the company, I can't remember. She shows up at his house and Archie kind of installs her. That's the word Nero Wolfe uses.
Prisoner's base.
Yes, prisoner's base. He's essentially hired, or this woman tries to hire him to let him stay in his house for several days until a certain time period, and she's going to pay him a certain amount of money, but she's not going to tell him anything about her, who she is. And Wolfe feels insulted by this. He doesn't know if she's a murderer, if she's just hysterical or what. And when he completely by coincidence finds out who she is while she's still in the house, he offers her a deal that she can pay him the $10,000 that she originally offered. No, I'm sorry. She can pay him the $10,000 that the man who showed up looking for her offered. Or she can leave and have 24 hours before he'll come tracking her down for this man. And it's clearly giving her options, but she doesn't take kindly to it, and that's a whole different story. She ends up getting murdered, and so now they're going to solve the murder because Archie's upset about it.
Right.
But yes, back to Fer-de-Lance.
So basically Wolfe makes a deal that he will protect the person that she is trying to protect if that person happens to be the murderer. And so they get her cooperation. And the next day Archie goes to White Plains to go talk with her brother, etc., etc., etc. This is kind of how he gets an in a lot of times, is that he, basically puts someone in a difficult spot, and even though they would hate to, under normal circumstances, talk to a detective, they kind of have to, and he kind of cajoles them into doing so.
It's actually a pretty brilliant red herring that he uses in a lot of his stories, where he'll present a character that there's always 1 to 5 characters in these stories that are obviously concealing something or obviously afraid of something. Yeah. And oftentimes he does such a good job of giving them different motivations for doing this that you can never really pick out who the murderer is until Nero Wolfe spills all. Usually something happens closer to the end of the book where it's like, oh, okay, this person's the murderer. And then you're just waiting for Nero Wolfe to explain, how all the pieces fit together.
Yeah.
But before that happens, there could be a character that is afraid they know the murderer and doesn't want them to be punished, but then it turns out that person is completely innocent and it was just a suspicion. Or someone shows up and doesn't want him to investigate because it'll harm their business, and they try to buy him off, but he doesn't fall for it, or he makes a deal with them that he'll do his best not to hurt their business.
Right.
So you're always presented with these possibilities for murderers, but you can never really pick them out because of how clever each one's motivation is.
Well, so Fer-de-Lance is interesting because you kind of know who the murderer is about 2/3 of the way through the book.
Yeah.
But then the question is, how do we catch him? And that's also an interesting technique, because I saw someone either wrote something or maybe did a video about Columbo, the television show Columbo.
Yeah.
And it's, mystery without, or tension without mystery, or something like that was the title of the article that I read, or the video that I saw. And the whole point of their argument was that in Columbo, you always get to see who the murderer is early on, and the chase is the interesting part. And so there's the Nero Wolfe books kind of have a combination of the best of both worlds there, because there is some element of the traditional, Agatha Christie style mystery. Here are the clues and see if you can figure it out. But oftentimes they find themselves in a situation where they have no evidence, and they have to either create, manufacture, or find evidence, and that becomes kind of the second rising action in the story.
Yeah, they're often referred to, like the Agatha Christie style stories are often referred to as the classic whodunits, and then the Columbo style stories are often called the howdunnits.
Right.
A lot of mystery stories where you know who the murderer is offhand they tend to revolve either around the way it was committed or what the motivation for committing it was.
Right. Or how procedurally they can be trapped into either betraying themselves or how evidence can be created that would cause them to allow them to be prosecuted.
Yeah, and sometimes in Columbo they would even present the mystery. They would show you how it was done and who did it, and you would actually see Columbo, slowly encircling the murderer by continuing to ask more questions and figure out more things and find more lies and discover more people that were involved in the situation. Because sometimes they'll show you the murderer hiding evidence in that show, or trying to trying to remove witnesses or something, and Columbo hasn't quite caught on yet, but he's slowly getting closer as this is happening. Yeah, and Nero Wolfe does this in a lot of the stories, actually, where he'll have figured out something about the murderer, and the murderer will do something possibly foolish or possibly as a last-ditch effort that fully exposes them. Like, maybe they'll kill another person, making it clear who it was.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll try to get rid of evidence and be caught in the act. Things like that. The Nero Wolfe mysteries are very versatile in that respect.
Yeah.
Because for the most part, they're not necessarily... I mean, they aren't really Agatha Christie-style mysteries. You mentioned this before, where you can't really sit down and figure out who the murderer is with all the information. You pretty much have to wait until the book tells you who the murderer is.
Well, the stuff is always there, but it's always so obscure or difficult that, you don't feel like the book expects you to figure it out. It's going to be something that Wolfe picked up on, or something that Wolfe came up with, and it's almost always going to be a pretty significant reach. There's never, or not never, but there's almost never like a strong amount of evidence that allows you to like solve the mystery super early or even in the middle. Oftentimes what happens is that Wolfe is like, oh, this is a thing that I noticed, but that usually happens near the end. And so you don't get that until the very, very end, that last clue that tells you what Wolfe picked up on.
Yeah, and even that's a little bit versatile, because they will drop hints as to how Wolfe is thinking. Sometimes the hint isn't really enough to go on, but other times it kind of like, if you have it in the back of your mind as you continue reading, you kind of start to pick up on what's going on around you. So like, one of the ones we'll talk about in another episode is Murder is Corny.
Yeah.
And at the beginning of that story, someone's murdered that delivers corn to Nero Wolfe's house. And he's talking to Inspector Kramer about it, and Kramer's sort of on a rampage because Archie Goodwin seems to be involved in the murder.
Right.
And Nero Wolfe, he brings Nero Wolfe this corn that wasn't delivered on time. And it's not the right corn. It's too old. The sizes aren't right. And the guy that is supposed to pick his corn knows what Nero Wolfe likes, because he's very specific about it. Right. And Nero Wolfe kind of offhand in the book says, "You failed to notice the point I was at pains to make. Who picked the corn?" And Inspector Kramer ignores this point, and it might just kind of pass you by.
It's intended to pass you by.
Yeah, it's intended to pass you by. But if you remember that as you're reading, it doesn't really tie in everything together to kind of give you much of a clue as to who the murderer is.
Right.
But it does give you an indication that Nero Wolfe's mind is pointing in a certain direction, and you can't really know with evidence who the murderer might be from that statement, but you can see where Nero Wolfe's eyes are looking and maybe guess who the murderer is because of that. So you're more likely in a Nero Wolfe mystery to figure out who the murderer is, it just kind of like by knowing how Nero Wolfe thinks and what he's thinking of and what he says, than you are to figure out who it is by the clues as they're presented early in the book.
Well, it's one of those things where if you pay very close attention to the things that Wolfe says, there often are clues in them, just kind of like you're saying. And the clues are often very indirect. And that's kind of one of the fun parts of these mysteries, is that things are... Because you're not really expected to figure out the mystery, you can read them with a much more smooth flow than, say, an Agatha Christie book where you're going to be constantly stopping and looking at diagrams and thinking about this or thinking about that.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that really makes the Nero Wolfe books kind of endlessly rereadable, because there's so much fun, interesting, colorful character interaction and dialogue, and the mystery is important, but figuring out the way there is made part of the fun. And so that's one of the reasons why I think I reread the Wolfe books way more frequently than I can reread any of the Christie novels, just because the Wolfe books are so colorful and engaging, and they don't feel like they're hitting you over the head with a mystery. It feels like an organic development. So,
yeah, and just a quick comparison to Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
Sherlock Holmes mysteries are very much like that, in the sense that you do not know who the murderer is until it has been clearly explained to you by Sherlock Holmes. Nero Wolfe does I feel like Nero Wolfe does a much better job of this, because they'll give you enough to where you can feel like you're solving the mystery with them. The Sherlock Holmes novels would often present you with all of these facts that Sherlock Holmes might make a comment or two about and kind of point you in a direction. But like a lot of those stories are Sherlock Holmes and Watson go out and gather all the clues. There's a couple of clever observations by Sherlock Holmes, and then they meet someone, and that person tells this long-winded story about things that have happened that are completely not unrelated, but they're so far removed from what you've been told in the story that you never would have had these clues and never would have been able to solve the mystery, but it's vital information to solving the mystery.
So one of the things about Sherlock Holmes is that a lot of the things that Sherlock Holmes does are almost like a superpower, where he just knows that the color of the dirt in a certain area is something, and that leads him, in some direction. And these things are like facts about reality that you would not be expected to know. But whenever Wolfe says, "Oh, this is what tipped me off," there's always a very human aspect to what tipped him off. It's always something that someone said carelessly, or something that where, like, you and everybody else had some kind of blind spot that, oh, this character is just a side character and they couldn't be the murderer. But Wolfe picks up on why they might be and kind of goes from there. There's a lot of... Despite... The interesting thing about Wolfe is that he's a very inhuman character, but all of his deductions are very humanist.
Yeah, and he doesn't actually work in the exact same way that Sherlock Holmes does. Sherlock Holmes is, he's deducing facts. He's deducing.
Right, but that's my point. That's what I'm trying to say.
Whereas,
is that
Nero Wolfe operates with
Holmes
a level
deals
of
with
intuition.
facts, and Wolfe deals with intuition and awareness of human nature, which is like really, really fun to read.
Yeah. Yeah, he sums it up a lot in lines that he has, like, everyone lies when the alternative is intolerable.
Right.
So Fer-de-Lance.
Yes. Well, this is the first Nero Wolfe book, so you get a lot of background. You get some background for Fritz. You get background for various characters. But basically, Wolfe is now has his eye on 50 grand. And so the question is, can we figure out how Barstow was murdered? And Wolfe kind of has an idea, because he's already asked Anna Fiore about the object that... in fact, he's asked her twice about the object that is crucial to the murder case. And so he already kind of knows how the murder was done, but not who did it. And so that becomes Wolfe's quest. Figure out who actually did it. Eliminate people who had, opportunity, and figure out who is the one who actually did do it. And this is an interesting thing because there's kind of a two-stage process here. Basically, Archie goes to go find the caddies that were at a golf match with Barstow right before he died. And Archie kind of pumps them for information and doesn't get anywhere. And then what we get to see is something that we get to see very often in these books is a Wolfe interrogation. And the thing about a Wolfe interrogation, well, there's two things about it. Number one, it usually starts with some kind of rhetorical flourish. In this case, Wolfe talks to the four caddies about... He tells a story about psychologists and how they are, even though they're trained to observe, they often fail to observe in a hectic situation, or when they're surprised. And then the second part of the Nero Wolfe interrogation is the going over the situation in the past, step by step, second by second, in total detail, because Wolfe never leaves the house. And so Wolfe relies on other people to tell him what has been happening. And so Wolfe is very good at getting people to go back over those steps and find things that they thought were insignificant, but are significant, or things that they misremembered because, they were in such because basically someone asked them a leading question without realizing it, and they ended up with a wrong conception of what actually happened. And then going over it is like, no, that's not what happened. This is what happened. That's what happens in this book. Basically, Wolfe is talking to these four caddies, and they're stepping through slowly, talking about every single second of the golf match right before Barstow gets hit with the dart from the golf club, and they stumble onto it. They hit it. They're like, oh, he wasn't using his golf club, and that changes everything.
Yeah, it actually speaks to the point that you had about how he understands human nature. Several things happen in that scene where he's interviewing the caddies. Now, they're supposed to be younger men or younger boys.
Yeah, they're boys. They go to school.
Yeah. So they show up at Nero Wolfe's, and he sits down in front of them. He tells them the story of a room full of psychologists who are part of an experiment they're not aware of, where someone runs into a room and he's running from someone with a gun, and then he runs out of the room, and then someone else comes in the room, shoots the guy with the gun, and then the third
knocks down the guy with the gun and takes the gun.
Yeah, and then first person comes back in the room, and he says, and every psychologist in that room was then told that this was part of an experiment, and they were to write down everything they observed, and not a single person in the room had a matching account. And this is kind of setting up. This is Nero Wolfe explaining human nature to these boys, because he's setting them up for, first off, as Archie points out, Nero Wolfe doesn't pull any punches when it comes to using big words. He's making them feel like he actually respects their intelligence in this scene. Mm-hmm. And the second thing that's happening is he's setting them up to try and prove that they can outdo these well-trained psychologists in this hypothetical situation, because he does take them through step by step, which is an important part of the Nero Wolfe books. The way that he does his detective work is probably the best that it's done in any detective novel. He doesn't really know exactly where to look like a lot of other detectives. They'll get a clue that will say, okay, this is the next thing I go and do because of this clue. Nero Wolfe will operate on the basis of, okay, I don't actually know where to start. So there's this group of people, and there's this event, and there's this item, and he'll send Archie to go talk to people that maybe sell something similar to something that was used or found at a crime scene. Or he'll send Saul, Fred, and Durkin to go and tail someone that was involved and see where they go at a certain time of day. Or he'll send Archie out somewhere to talk to several people and possibly pick up a few more names that he'll then have Archie go talk to the next day. There will often be these gaps in the story where Archie's not doing anything, and he's frustrated with Wolfe because he feels like he should be doing work, and Nero Wolfe doesn't have anything for him. But then out of nowhere, Nero Wolfe would be like, oh, remember this obscure thing that you heard from this person? Go and talk to this person about it. And there's even times where he doesn't have anything to go on, and so he'll have Archie go stir up the newspapers and drop a line to his friend Lon Cohen, get him to put something in the newspapers that will stir someone to activity. It's a little bit refreshing compared to the way that most detective novels work.
Yeah.
But he tackles these boys by making them feel like they're actually, he's really considering their intelligence and putting them on the spot, really going over fine details with them. Archie mentions that he lets them, kind of talk amongst themselves just like they would talk if they're enjoying just sitting around and having a good old time with each other, but they're talking about the situation, and when they get too far out of it, or if they jump ahead in this timeline where they're trying to get all these details, Wolfe will continually bring them back, and he's kind of checking to make sure that at every moment they can account for every single golf club that they're carrying, and
their own personal locations and stuff like that.
Yeah, because there's 4 golfers involved in this situation where this guy dies, and there's 4 caddies. And so he's relying on the observation of these caddies to pick out anything that will give him a clue as to what might have actually happened and who might be involved in the murder, if anyone. And he gets there. And it's just because one of the boys offhand mentions exactly what was missing to point them directly to the murderer, and it sort of happens in a, you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention. And Archie Goodwin makes a comment about how it kind of unfolded out of nowhere when one of the boys said, "Oh, well, no, he actually used the club from this other guy. He borrowed his club because his caddy was over looking for a ball."
Right.
And so Nero Wolfe kind of jumps on that, and he clarifies it. He spends several minutes talking to each of the boys, saying, "So you're sure you were over there during this time, and you're sure you saw what you saw?" He really nails down the facts so that when it comes time to determine what to do next, he's certain of what he already has.
Yeah, and now they know who the murderer is, or at least they have a very good idea of who the murderer is, but they have 0 evidence against him. And so now the question becomes, well, okay, so there's 2 possibilities for the murderer, and one of them is very unlikely compared to the other one. So they're like, it's probably this guy, but we got to prove it. And so basically now they start to rile up the person. It turns out basically that Barstow was murdered by mistake. That the poison needle was intended for someone else. And therefore, what they do is they start to rile up the guy who was supposed to have been murdered. And that sets the rest of the story in motion.
Yeah, they've had several exchanges between Archie Goodwin and the Barstow family at this point, and a few exchanges with the district attorney. And now they have to find evidence of someone that they know is the murderer. But they like you said, they've riled up the father of the murderer, has been told that he was actually the target. And once he drops the hint that it was his son that was going to kill him, this guy specifically doesn't even want protection from this.
Right.
He kind of disappears, and Wolfe has an inkling that he might actually be going to try and talk to his son about this. And he doesn't... Nero Wolfe tends not to feel responsible for a lot of things unless it serves his purposes. He's not particularly concerned that this man might be going to his death and that his son is going to kill him.
He's often very willing to let people do that, honestly.
Yeah.
It's a very peculiar character point of Nero Wolfe that he calls them natural processes, right? One person killing another because of something that the other person did to him in the past or something like that. And so, Wolfe is very much a hands-off kind of guy when it comes to what he calls natural processes. And sometimes the things that Wolfe thinks are natural processes are cycles of violence, like murder and followed by another murder kind of thing.
Yeah, and so the way he sees it, either nothing happens to this guy, but Nero Wolfe is pretty convinced that, judging by the story he heard from the father, that this is a vengeance-motivated thing.
Yeah.
And
well, he's almost certain of it because the guy basically confesses to the events that motivate the son. And the guy's like, well, my son doesn't know about that, but, Nero Wolfe knows better.
Yeah, it's kind of obvious that there isn't really much other reason presented that his son might want to kill him. So when the story unfolds that
the thing about it is that there's another possibility, and that possibility is that the Elder Kimball wanted to kill the Elder Barstow, and they need to rule that out first. And so by doing this, by going to the Elder Barstow and basically riling him up, they either are going to cause the Elder Kimball by riling him up, they're either going to if he's the one if he actually tried to murder Barstow, and he handed over the golf club as kind of like a part of that plan, then they need to be prepared for that contingency. This is one of the things that Archie mentions a little earlier in the story. Archie's like, Wolfe was there willing to bet 10 grand that this guy, based on a newspaper article clipped out of a newspaper in a rooming house, and a man falling over on a golf course. Wolfe was willing to bet 10 grand and his reputation on that needle being there. And one of the points Archie makes is that this seems crazy to me because, like, it's so far-fetched that like, you would hardly believe that it's a thing. But at the same time, Wolfe has his reputation because when he does a stunt like this, he's always right. And you have to always be right when you pull that kind of stunt, is one of the points that Archie makes.
Yeah, and it's not so outlandish when you're presented with all the details that Wolfe based his theory on. The genius part of it was that he was able to connect the building of this club that had a poisoned dart in it with this murder on a golf course, because it actually seems obvious
with this death on a golf. I mean, the thing is that number one, they don't actually know anything about the club other than that someone requested it and Carlo is dead.
Yeah,
they don't know that this club has a needle in it or anything like that. That's one of Wolfe's kind of leaps of logic, and they don't know that Barstow was murdered either. They only know that Barstow died on the golf course, and Wolfe connects those two up. So it's one of those things where there's a pretty significant inspired leap of logic there, but it turns out to be right. And Wolfe is very good at these kinds of leaps. Is another thing, yeah.
Yeah, in fact, one of the things he does early on is he has someone bring a bunch of golf clubs to his office and demonstrate swinging a golf club so that he can get a view of what the angles would be while swinging a golf club to try and determine if a dart could be shot out of a mechanism inside a golf club. And
where it would hit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because that's part of the bet, is that it's in his stomach or below his stomach. And so Wolfe had to see a man swing a golf club to know where a needle would hit if it was shot out of the shaft of a golf club. So anyway, they've riled up Edie Kimball, the elder Kimball, and they don't know, So the younger Kimball basically comes and says, "My father told me everything that you told me," which is a common. This is really common in Wolfe stories, is that someone claims to have information from another person, but they were only told part of the story, kind of thing. That's what happens here, is that Edie Kimball tells his son part of the story, and Kimball comes in and says, he basically tries to say, "Oh, this whole golf club thing is nonsense, blah, 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 blah." Wolfe's not having any part of it, and so they send him away without anything happening, basically. But it's clear now that they've flushed the murderer into the possibility of betraying himself.
Yes,
and this is one of those things where,
Well, however, they still don't have hard evidence that could really prove anything.
Right. So this leads to the action scene in the book, which basically Archie's gone, Wolfe's up in the plant rooms, and someone comes and with a note that says that it's from Sarah Barstow and asks for some orchids. And so Wolfe cuts some orchids and gives it to the guy, and the guy goes away. Archie comes back in the afternoon, and Wolfe is in the office, sitting there, basically motionless. And Archie's like, "What's going on?" And Wolfe is like, "There's death in this room." And, Archie kind of freaks out. He's like, "Is it a bomb? We got to get you out of here," kind of thing. Tells Fritz to fill the sink up with water. And Wolfe says, "No, it's not a bomb. I've listened," and they make sounds. Which, this is 1933, so yeah. And they basically Wolfe basically deduces the only thing that Manuel Kimball saw me do was open a drawer of my desk and put my hand into it. And so he says, I think I know where the danger is. And so he has Archie take a walking stick and push the drawer out from behind, and out springs the titular Fer-de-Lance. It strikes at Wolfe. They manage to
it's a type of snake. we should mention.
It's a type of snake. It's a viper. And Wolfe manages to smash its head with a beer bottle. And Archie, is beating at it with a stick, but, Wolfe deals the final blow, basically. And now they know for sure what's going on. They now know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, who the murderer is, what his plan was, what his plan is for now. And they also know a lot about his character. They know that he will 100% make sure that Wolfe and any other loose ends are dealt with before he tries again. And so, Wolfe believes that. Archie's more skeptical about that fact. But Wolfe is like, no, we have time. We can figure this out.
Well, we need to clarify.
So now begins
a couple of things here because we kind of glossed over them. But the snake thing is indicative of what's going on because the elder Kimball he lived in South America for a while, had a wife, and his wife pretty much cheated on him with another man. The kid that is there with them is probably not his kid, but he murdered the wife and the guy who was cheating in cold blood.
His friend, yeah.
And he left the kid there, and then he came back 4 years and collected him and brought him home to try and raise him as a son, kind of feeling sorry for him or something. So the idea with the snake is that the venom in the golf club, the poison was snake venom, and this snake that Nero Wolfe finds in his drawer is from South America, and it's kind of a situation where if the elder Kimball didn't die by golf club, the plan was to bring this snake in from South America and use that to plant a trap for him and kill him. But given the grave situation, the murderer
to get more venom out of it or something like that.
Yeah, something like that
too.
But given the grave circumstance the murderer is in because of Nero Wolfe, the murderer instead uses the snake to try and assassinate Nero Wolfe, making it all too clear based on where the snake comes from, who he's been interacting with, and just the whole situation that, yes, it is indeed Manuel Kimball that is the murderer, or the one who was attempting to murder his own father, which is still.
But they still have no evidence. Yes. But this lets E.D. Kimball out. Now it's certain that E.D. Kimball is not the murderer. It is now definitely Manuel. Definitely Manuel trying to kill his father. And they just need to figure out evidence. But they don't have any. The only thread that they have to pull on is Anna Fiore. Anna Fiore basically talked to Wolfe once and was conversational. And then talked to him a second time and clammed up. And they noticed this, and so they ask her about it. And they find out that she got $100 in the mail to not tell anybody about Carlo Maffei or golf clubs. And they can't figure out how to get her to open up. And so they hatch a scheme, which is another thing that happens frequently in these books.
Oh, yeah. Before you go on, we should mention, especially in this book, there's like 3 main points that kind of give you an idea of how Nero Wolfe thinks in these situations. What you're about to tell is one of them, but jumping back just a bit, after they killed the snake, he has Archie mail the snake's body to Manuel Kimball. Right.
Yeah, that is a fun little moment. So anyway, basically they hatch a scheme to stage a robbery and convince Anna Fiore that she can't trust the guy who sent her the $100. And so they do. This is something they do in several of the books. They will stage a hijacking, stage a robbery, and use that to either get information from someone or get a chance to look at something or something like that. So basically, they find out that Anna Fiore has been sitting on, literally, all of this evidence that absolutely 100% points to Manuel Kimball. And that allows them to... Now they have the evidence. The question is, what do they do with it? And this is another thing that Wolfe often does, is he basically sends Archie to Anderson's office and says, we know who killed Kimball, or we know who killed Barstow, and we have evidence, and you have 2 choices. You can either give me $10,000, and I'll give you the evidence with, under certain circumstances, or I will give you the evidence with a bunch of reporters in tow at the same time, so that they can ask you how you didn't figure this stupid thing out.
This is also something that is much more indicative of the times. These are things that... So So technically, Nero Wolfe is following the law here. He's saying that, yes, I'm not going to withhold evidence, but I get to give the evidence on my terms. And he's offering to either give it to Anderson with for the $10,000, or have the press march it into Anderson's office with the murderer, and basically Wolfe will get all the credit and have this big to-do and kind of embarrass Anderson. He's trying to weasel money out of him, essentially.
Well, it's not just weasel money out of him, because basically there's little hints here and there, but basically Anderson, there was a Goldsmith case a few years back, and Anderson basically took information from Wolfe and didn't credit him.
Yeah.
And instead acted in such a way that Wolfe got lost reputation through that case. And so they're basically like, yeah, we're not gonna let you do that again. So either you give us the $10,000 or we humiliate you. And he decides to give him the $10,000. And then Wolfe hatches another scheme, which is also common in the Nero Wolfe books. This is one of my
favorite schemes in all of Nero Wolfe.
It's very hard to prosecute a dead man. And so Wolfe often figures out a way to either kill the murderer or have the murderer kill himself. And in this case, Wolfe sends enough information to Manuel Kimball that Kimball knows it's over. Saul Panzer is going to prevent him from flying away. They're going to prevent him from driving away with, Fred Durkin on his tail there, and Bill Gore and Ori Cathcart there. And he's trapped. He knows that he is done for. But Wolfe gives him enough time and enough rope to basically do the one last thing that he needed and wanted to do. And that is kill his father. Archie arrives to point out the murderer and give Anderson the evidence, and Kimball and his father are both up in the air in an airplane. And Manuel Kimball intentionally crashes the plane, leading to his death and the elder Kimball's death. By happenstance, the murderer's face is still intact, and so Archie can point to him and say, yes, that's the man. But basically, the way that the story ends is Wolfe and Archie having a conversation in the office that ends the way a few stories end. Basically, Archie says, but wait a minute. You also, and Wolfe kind of makes a case for why he would allow Manuel Kimball to kill his father. Basically, if Manuel Kimball doesn't get to kill his father, he's a broken man. He's going to be executed for the murder that he did commit already anyway. So, this would be destroying him twice. And Edie Kimball, in Wolfe's mind, is already dead. And if Manuel Kimball dies first, Edie Kimball has no wife. He has no other kids. He would just basically, shuffle through the last couple of years of his life a broken man as well. And so Wolfe's like, yeah, so I gave, Manuel Kimball the opportunity to solve both of these problems and make sure that neither of them, has this horrible end to him. And Archie's like, well, no, but you're missing the one other major point. And Wolfe's like, well, what's that? And Archie's like, well, the other point is that if they actually captured him alive and had him go to court, you'd have to get up off your butt and drive all the way out to White Plains and sit on a witness chair. And the story ends with Wolfe saying, "Indeed."
Yes, Nero Wolfe was not above killing two people in order to avoid having to testify in court, because he hates getting out of his chair that much.
Basically, yes.
And sometimes the story tries to make you a little sympathetic for it, because they did point out that the elder Kimball was indeed a murderer himself. So there's a sense of justice being done here, because he points out when he's telling his story that in South America at the time, nobody would bat an eye at someone shooting their wife if she cheated on them.
Yeah.
And so you're left with this situation where it's like, okay, so the one guy's trying to kill his father. That makes him bad. His father is also pretty bad for having killed this guy's parents, but he'll never stand trial for it. And Nero Wolfe brings them both to justice in a way which pretty much is completely self-centered.
Prevents him from having to get out of the chair. Yeah. And that is Fer-de-Lance.
Yeah. Yeah, we did gloss over a lot. We didn't actually mention anywhere that Kimball was a pilot.
I've said this before, but the mystery is not the main draw of the Nero Wolfe book. You can still go and sit down and read Fer-de-Lance, and you will still have fun doing it, even though we've told you who the killer is and how the book ends. Because there's a lot of fun to be had in getting there. And that's one of the great things about the Nero Wolfe books, is that you can read them over and over again, even though you know who the killer is and you know all the intricacies. You can still read it again because Archie's voice is so much fun to listen to, and all the characters are so much fun to watch dealing with Archie and dealing with Wolfe.
Yeah, like, take Anna Fiore, for instance. When you first meet her, she seems somewhat reasonably willing to tell Nero Wolfe what she knows, but she also has the situation where she's been given hush money, and she doesn't have much money, and she's kind of a simple girl, but as she puts it, she's not exactly dumb, and she wants that money to fetch herself a husband at some point, which is why at the end of the story, after Wolfe and Archie are going through their expenses, they're going to give her, when they...
Wolfe complains.
Yeah, Wolfe complains.
You made a mistake in the accounting here, because Anna Fiore's $100 has an extra zero in front of the decimal point. And Archie basically says, yeah, it does. I know it does. And what are you going to do about it?
Tough cookie.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they end up giving her $1,000 at the end instead of the 100, which is what the whole fake robbery was about. They pretended to be the murderer and stole the $100 from her, because then in her mind, she would be like, oh, well, this guy paid me that money to stay silent, and I did. But then he showed up and threatened to kill me and took the money back from me. I have no obligation to him now. So she immediately spilled the beans to Wolfe and gave him the evidence, which is how they turned that story around. And, of course, she never finds out that it was actually Archie and Ori Cather and Bill Gore that assaulted her and Miss Maffei and took the money. Miss Maffei knows, but obviously she's not going to tell because she's helping them convince her to give them the evidence.
Right.
But she goes through these stages. For as thin a character as she is in the story, and as unimportant as her personality might be, she has a very strong personality of at first. You know, she doesn't have much trouble saying anything that she feels like saying. But the minute it comes to anything that she's been paid to be quiet about, she stands firm, which Archie simultaneously hates, but
kind of grudgingly respects.
Yeah, grudgingly respects, and Nero Wolfe feels the same about it. It's interesting to see the way that Nero Wolfe operates a lot of times, though, because it's very, very far removed from most detective novels. You'll see a lot of detectives who will push the boundaries of the law sometimes, but most of them aren't doing things like getting the murderers to off themselves or faking burglaries to influence people's willingness to comply. It's something
it's very fun to watch the gears turn in a Nero Wolfe story.
Yeah, he has genius ways of pushing the right buttons to get things done that he wants done.
Yeah.
And pretty much every story will have one or two instances like that at least.
Yep.
Not always him assaulting someone or getting someone to kill themselves either. No, sometimes it's quite the opposite.
There's a lot of variety. There's a lot of variety and a lot of cleverness. And that's one of the other things that makes these books so rereadable, is that, you know, sometimes you just marvel at the fun ideas that Rex Stout came up with to help his characters solve the mystery.
Yeah, and it's incredibly fun sometimes to watch people gain an admiration for Wolfe for something that he does that is not his true intention, such as there's a story where this woman has something she wants to confess to him, but she doesn't feel good about it because he's being paid by a group that she doesn't like. And he has Archie Goodwin cancel the retainer from this group. And so then she's willing to confess it. And Archie Goodwin is flabbergasted by this. Now, she has a renewed respect for Wolfe because it's like, oh, he basically threw away, what was it, $100,000 or something?
$30K.
Oh, $30K? Oh, that's right, yeah. He throws away $30K, and this woman is like, okay, well, now you're not under their influence, now I can tell you everything. And it's likely she leaves with more respect for him. Archie Goodwin is like, what are you doing? We're not seriously doing this, right? And Nero Wolfe is like, no, we're going to...
We're doing this.
Yes, I gave her my word. And later on, the group that had originally paid him is now offering a $100,000 reward Or actually, I think it's presented before that happens, so Nero Wolfe kind of knows that he's got a
he knows about the reward before when he does this.
Yeah, and it takes Archie a minute to figure out that that's what's going on, that he's really after that $100,000 instead of just the $30,000. So he's not exactly as noble as he made himself out to this woman, but in her eyes, that's always how he will look.
Right.
He does that in a lot of stories. His admiration is usually well-earned, but a lot of times it's misdirected.
Right.
And he does, it's not like he's not a completely dishonorable person either. When he has a client, he will go above and beyond to protect his client, even at the risk of, sometimes even at the risk of the law coming after him personally.
Right. All right. Well, that is our coverage of Fer-de-Lance. Yeah. Thanks for listening. We will be covering Trio for Blunt Instruments next week, so keep an eye out for that. There's a big difference between a full-length novel, a full 300-page novel by Stout, compared to a smaller book that contains 3 novellas, and we'll kind of get into some of the differences next time. So,
yeah, read some Nero Wolfe.
Stay tuned for that. Yeah, read some Nero Wolfe, and we will see you next week. As always, we are the Wordy Pair. I'm Rudy,
and I'm Justin,
and we will see you next week. Or I guess you'll hear us next week.
Phooey.
Later. Ha ha ha.
Thanks for listening to the Wordy Pair Podcast. Our passion is all things writing, world building, and getting into the weird and wonderful world of fiction. We hope you enjoyed our unique takes. If you did, make sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe to get your weekly dose of writing weirdness. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, hit us up on Twitter. For Rudy, it's @Rudolph_Cone. And for Justin, @Ninja Mouse Chew. See you next time on the Wordy Pair Podcast.